Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader, and welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do as you discover, develop, and deploy your own Black Belt leader within. Hey, let me ask you a question. Do you remember from a famous movie in the 1970s this particular tagline? In space, no one can hear you scream. Now, if you recognize that, you probably know that came from the 1979 sci-fi thriller Alien. And that movie set off an incredible series of sequels as once again and again and again, we saw Sigourney Weaver and other characters fight these incredible aliens from outer space. And if you remember the original movie trailer, in the original movie trailer, toward the end of the trailer, you saw this particular line: in space, no one can hear you scream. Now, this particular phrase, although it took on a phrase all of its own, it really highlights a very basic scientific principle. And that principle is this: sound needs a medium like air to travel. Space is essentially a vacuum, so sound doesn't transmit in space. Without an air particle to vibrate or a water particle to vibrate, some particle to vibrate, sound can't travel through space. So by definition, the absence of sound is silence. Now, if we go back and look at ancient history, we see silence often associated with either contemplation or meditation. Silence was also an integral part of much religious reverence that we saw in ancient cultures, as well as being utilized to pay homage to a deity. You know, if we go back to ancient Greece and we study the philosophers that were there, those philosophers considered silence to be a virtue for obvious reasons, but to them, silence emphasized the value of thoughtful consideration before speaking, or the potential of silence to reveal more than words could express. Now, during the Renaissance, we saw a renewed interest in the philosophy of human potential. The philosophy of the teachers of that day was really to affirm the ability of individuals to lead moral, ethical lives through logic and reason. Now, this led to a more nuanced understanding of science as a way to express complex emotions and ideas, and you see it permeating through literature, through art, and through music. Now, Leonardo da Vinci, probably one of the most famous faces of the Renaissance era, he noted this: nothing strengthens authority so much as silence. So much to be said for silence just being the absence of sound. Nothing strengthens authority as much as silence. Now, fast forward a couple of hundred years to the Enlightenment era, and we saw the world introduced to Romanticism. Now, Romanticism was a powerful artistic, literary, and intellectual movement, and it initially flourished in Europe and later on spread to the United States during the late 18th and early 19th century. Romanticism emphasized individual emotion and imagination, along with the beauty of nature and, you guessed it, the sound of silence. Now, the 20th century brought about the rise of mass media. It started with radio and later with television. And towards the end of the century, what did we see? The birth of the internet and social media. Silence became something to be filled with music, commercials, talking, or sound effects. Silence became devoted to a moment in between excerpts of a radio show or a television show, or silence was simply devoted to a moment as part of a religious service. So sound ultimately became noise, and today sound, aka noise, permeates every facet of our lives. Silence was something to be filled with something, anything, rather than something to be valued and appreciated and considered. You know, William Burroughs, one of the famous individuals in the early 20th century, said this: silence is only frightening to people who are compulsively verbalizing. I love that phrase. Silence is only frightening to people who can't stop talking. That to me is brilliant. It really epitomizes what we see in society today. Now, if we fast forward from the early 20th century into the 21st century, and we've come out of COVID, we've seen all of the problems that social media has brought to society. There has become a longing in society today to escape from the hustle and the bustle, to escape from the noise of life, and to find a place of solitude where the sound of silence can be heard, can be valued, and can be appreciated. It has become an integral part of what today we refer to as the self-care culture. I mean, think about it. In our anxious, stress-filled culture today, people are rediscovering, for many, the very first time, the power of silence as a very simple but effective therapeutic tool to gain a sense of peace, a sense of calmness, and a sense of tranquility. But there's also a very practical benefit to silence. And if we look back over the years, it's promoted a number of interesting and at times humorous insights. Let me share a few quotes around silence from some people you may or may not know from history. Abraham Lincoln, one of my favorite quotes on silence is this. Abraham Lincoln famously said, "It's better to remain silent and to be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." Now, there's a great amount of wisdom in that. Better to remain silent and thought a fool than open your mouth and prove to everyone around you how foolish you really are. Muhammad Ali said this. He said, "Silence is golden when you can't think of an answer." And Josh Billings said this. He said, "Silence is one of the hardest arguments to refute." How do you refute silence? Martin Luther King famously said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." He was speaking to those who simply stood in solidarity, challenging an injustice in that period of time. Now, these men understood the sound and the power of silence. And now I want to introduce a concept maybe you haven't considered, and I want to lean into this because it's the topic of today's podcast, the sound of silence. Silence is a sound. Now, maybe you go, "Well, John, silence by definition is the absence of sound. How can you say silence is a sound?" Well, if you don't believe me, ask Julian Treasure. Now, if you don't know who Julian Treasure is, he is a 5-time TED speaker with over 150 million views of his signature talk. Julian Treasure is one of the most sought after global speakers on the subject of sound and of communication. Now, his insights into speaking, but more importantly, effective listening, makes him one of the top trainers in the world. You know, Julian often reminds his audience of a simple but profound truth. Here's what he says. Without the gaps between words, conversation is nothing more than endless noise. Let me say that again. Without the gaps between the words, conversation is nothing more than endless noise. So silence, according to Julian Treasure and according to many people today studying human behavior and looking at sound, silence itself is a sound. Now, silence again brings some powerful benefits to our lives. And one of the benefits of the sound of silence is that it gives us an opportunity to reset, to refocus, and to recalibrate our lives. It gives us a moment in time to process, to reflect, to consider, to contemplate, to evaluate, to analyze, and to extrapolate. In short, silence provides us with an opportunity to gain understanding we may not have had before, or to gain a deeper understanding of something we already knew. Now, I don't know, but if you're like me, you've probably been around people that I've been around over the years who simply can't stop talking. These are the individuals that mindlessly drone on for hours, spewing an endless parade of words without ever seeming to come up for air. Try as they might, they can't stop talking. They just throw up words all day, every day, all day long. And you know, it doesn't matter how hard you and I lean in to practice active listening. When we get around these people that simply can't stop talking, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time making sense of what they're actually trying to say because it becomes, in the words of Julian Treasure, nothing more than endless noise. And sometimes I have to stop those individuals that want to endlessly talk, and I'll say, time out, wait a minute, slow down so I can understand what you're saying. You know, if we've ever been around that person, every single one of us is waiting with bated breath for that pivotal moment when those individuals finally pause and they have to take a breath. And that gives us a chance to process, to respond, to cut them off, to ask a question, to really figure out what they're saying, or better yet, to simply excuse ourselves from the conversation and move on. You know, sometimes our ears and even our brains need a break. Now, think about what I just said. If our ears and our brains need a break from endless talking of people around us, maybe sometimes the sound of silence is going to be beneficial to our physical body in other ways. So, silence by itself gives our physical senses and the thoughts that we think a respite from the endless noise that surrounds us, that engulfs us, and at times overwhelms us throughout the day. Silence can provide you and I with a moment of peace and tranquility when we can be one with our thoughts. Now, that to me is so satisfying when I can have a moment just to be alone with my thoughts. And here's what I've learned, it's in those moments of quiet. It's in those moments of contemplation where there is no really external noise around us. It's in that moment of silence that you and I have the opportunity to become face to face with ourselves. Now, I'm here to tell you, in this world where everything is about noise and sound, silence is an intentional act. It's a choice we get to make, and in my opinion, it's a choice we should make more often. Now, if you've ever had an opportunity to listen to any of the great courses, Julian Treasure has a course in the great courses. And in that training series, in that great courses, it's entitled How to Speak So That People Want to Listen. Julian Treasure notes that one of the benefits of silence is the opportunity to savor life. I mean, think about it. Who doesn't enjoy a walk in the woods where there is no talking, there is no automobile noise, there is no radio, there is no television, there is no internet? It is simply you and the quiet sounds of nature that really gives us a moment to take solace and to really savor the moment being in nature. So one of the reasons I love to take my dogs for walks in the woods is I can escape the hustle and bustle of life. And while I may not completely escape silence, because I can still hear the chirp of the birds, the whisper of the wind as it blows through the trees, and my steps as I walk down the trail, it's in those moments when I can really tune the world out around me that I get an opportunity to have a respite from the endless noise around me. And that's what silence does for every single one of us. I love the example that Julian Treasure shares in his course, How to Speak So People Want You to Listen. He talks about utilizing silence as an opportunity to savor a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or a cup of wine, to appreciate the taste and the texture of a flavored food, or as I like to say, to savor someone's company without having to even say a word. That's why I think dogs are such amazing creatures. They don't have to say a word, but simply their companionship of silently being beside you brings you a sense of comfort and a sense of connection that makes our lives better. And that's why I love my dogs. But it's in silence, again, that you and I get to connect with our thoughts. And that's important for a very specific reason when it comes to black belt leadership. Now, I believe, and you've heard me say this before, that every day there's a lesson that life wants to teach us. But the problem for far too many of us is we never take a break from the endless noise and distractions all around us to pause, to get quiet, and to simply listen to life as it's trying to speak. Now, silence can provide us with an incredible opportunity to listen to the whisper of life, as the whisper of life is seeking to speak into our ear and into our thoughts the secrets and wisdom that it wants to share to enrich our lives in some way. Silence has a voice that you and I need to hear much more often than we hear. Now, silence can communicate as effectively and sometimes more effectively than words. Silence can convey deep meaning and deep insight, often with much greater impact than spoken words. We see this in film, we see this on stage, we see this in comedy, we see this in speeches where people will talk and they will give what I refer to as a pregnant pause to encourage people to lean in to what was either just said or what is about to be shared. Now, silence can also highlight the importance of not just listening with our ears, but also learning to listen with our heart and to understand the deeper messages that throughout life often remain unspoken. Silence can transport us to a place in our lives where we can actually hear our own inner voice and we can get connected with our inner self, our intuition, our subconscious. Now, when we had those opportunities to actually listen to ourselves and connect to our intuition, this gives us an opportunity for introspection, for reflection, and moments of self discovery. Silence can turn a moment into a learning opportunity, into a learning library that can transform our lives in a meaningful and thoughtful way. Now, silence can also be a meditation zone where we learn to connect with ourselves and to become one with our thoughts, but also connect to a higher power. If we go back and look through history in religious circles, silence creates a moment where you and I get an opportunity to meet our Maker, to experience His presence, to hear His voice, and to commune with our Creator. Some have said that silence is where we actually get an opportunity to breathe the breath of God. We get to connect with His divine presence and we get to grow deeper in our faith. I think the psalmist wrote it well when he penned the words that we see in Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." And for you that are people of faith like me, you understand what that means. But you don't have to be a person of faith to appreciate and find value in the sound of silence, because it's in sound of silence that you and I obtain direction and guidance for our lives, and it's where we discover our very purpose for being. Now, many of you may have read the classic book by Gary Chapman, The Five Love Languages. In this book, Gary outlines the 5 basic ways that we express love to other people. These include words of affirmation, quality time, the receiving of gifts, and I like to include the giving of gifts in that, acts of service, which could also include the giving of gifts, and physical touch. 5 love languages: words of affirmation, quality time, receiving of gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. But interestingly enough, there's a growing number of human behavior experts that believe there is actually a 6th love language that's often overlooked or ignored. And you guessed it, that 6th love language is silence. Think about it from a love language perspective. Silence can truly be a powerful and meaningful love language, especially in relationships, because it's in relationships where we find comfort, ease, and shared experience, and an opportunity to value those things. So, silence in a relationship can be a way to show respect for boundaries, to provide emotional support without saying a word, or simply to allow a comfortable space for connection. Silence can be powerful, but you and I all know, and we probably experience those moments when silence can be awkward. So, why is that? Well, our brains are wired to interpret social cues. We are social creatures that were created to be in relationship with other people. That's why we're human beings, not human doings. And because our brains are hardwired to interpret social cues, when those social cues are absent for an extended period of time, even just for a few seconds or a moment, all of a sudden we begin to experience uncertainty, confusion, and sometimes anxiety in our thoughts. Now, as humans, we interpret silence often as disinterest, confusion, or disapproval. And silence can amplify our internal thoughts, especially those thoughts that make us feel disconnected with other people. And that's what makes us feel uncomfortable. So, what do? When silence gets awkward, we rush to fill the void of silence with chatter. And what is chatter? It's more endless noise. So, embracing silence is powerful because it allows for critical thinking. It allows us to pause and let our brain catch up and to process the information that we just received. Silence also allows for emotional processing. What are the feelings and emotions that are being conveyed by another person? And as a result of taking a moment of silence to critically analyze, to emotionally process, this can lead to us having a deep and more meaningful connection with the people that are around us. Now, silence is also beneficial to our physical, our mental, and our emotional health. And the sound of silence has incredible benefits that you may not be aware of. Let me take a moment and share a few. Silence can help with stress reduction. That's one of the biggies. That's number one in terms of my physical, mental, and emotional benefits of silence. It can help calm the nervous system. It can reduce stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. But more importantly, when we embrace silence and we relish in that moment, our brains can release those positive feel good endorphins that says, hey, this is great. Whatever you're doing, let's go back and do that again. And when we get silent and we pause from the stress and the hustle and bustle of life, guess what also happens? Silence helps lower our blood pressure, which is a major contributor to heart disease, and practicing silence can lead to a better quality and more restful hours of sleep. And it's during sleep that our body has an opportunity to repair and restore itself. It's where our brain gets a chance to filter through all of the things that happen during the day and to process our memories so they stick and to flush all the unnecessary things from our thoughts so they don't hang around when tomorrow becomes today. Now, there's other benefits to silence that you may not know, and the fact that silence can quiet the mind. And when we can quiet the mind, we can enjoy better concentration and better focus. That's why when you need to concentrate and you need to focus, sometimes silence can be your best friend. Silence can also lead to mental clarity. And when we're mentally clear, guess what? You and I can be more productive. So mental clarity boosts productivity. Silence can also serve as a powerful catalyst for creative thinking. Again, as I've already said, it allows for moments of self-reflection and self-discovery because it is in silence when we have the opportunity to explore new ideas. And guess what? You can't hear when you're thinking, and when you're thinking, you can't enjoy the benefits that silence wants to offer to your life. Understand this, silence encourages mindfulness. I believe we all need to be more mindful. Silence can promote self-awareness. It can promote a deeper connection with our deep thoughts and feelings. When we practice mindfulness, guess what happens as a benefit of that? It promotes a general sense of well-being, and that again lowers our stress and anxiety levels while boosting our mood at the same time. Silence has also been proven to reduce muscle tension, to relax our bodies, and improve our overall well-being. Embracing silence ultimately does what? It leads to a sense of inner peace and tranquility. And as I've already shared, it provides a respite from the constant noise and distractions of daily life, the endless noise that Julian Treasure I referred to earlier. Now, recent research, and I find this interesting, recent research is also suggesting that spending time in silence can stimulate brain cell growth. Now, there's been some studies in the National Institutes of Health and other regions that are studying this right now. And what they're finding is this, is that when we engage in intentional acts of silence for a period of time, it stimulates brain cell growth in general, but in particular in the area of the hippocampus. Now, why is that important? Because the hippocampus is the region of our brain that is associated with learning and memory. So if we want to learn more and to retain more and to recall what we previously learned, maybe we need to engage in more intentional acts of silence more often. Now, similar studies have also shown that when we practice silence, it allows the brain to process information more efficiently, it allows the brain to think more clearly, and it allows us to communicate more effectively. That's why it's so important when you learn the art of active listening. Active listening, one of the elements of that, and I teach it, and you can find that teaching on my website, blackbeltleadership.com. When we practice active listening, we engage in a moment of silence after the other person speaks so we can process what they just said, evaluate how to respond so that we can communicate more effectively. And Julian Treasure points it out in the training I referred to earlier. Science can enhance communication by allowing more thoughtful and meaningful interactions. Because when we learn to more actively and intentionally listen, we get more understanding and more insight of not only the words that were shared, but the meaning behind them. And now we can go deeper in our discussions with others. So those are many of the benefits, and there are many more, but those are 10 I wanted to share with you. And maybe up to this point, you thought silence was just the absence of sound. Well, I'm here to tell you that silence is much, much more. And when we learn to practice the sound of silence, as you can see, there are incredible benefits to our physical bodies, to our mental well-being, and to our emotional state. So remember this, silence is a sound. It is a distinct auditory event. And when we experience silence, our brain processes silence just like it processes sound. But more importantly, silence amplifies our internal thoughts, our feelings, and our emotions. It lets us connect with ourselves. Now, when we experience silence in a way that is distinct from the absence of sound, something unique happens. When we experience silence, oftentimes when we are intentional about it, it can even shape and affect our perception of time. Because it's in silence that you and I have the opportunity to truly hear, to become intimately aware of the world around us. Remember, in silence, we become one with our thoughts. We gain a deeper understanding and a greater appreciation of the world around us. And it's in silence that you and I have the opportunity to experience more peace and more tranquility in our lives. And in this anxious, stress-filled world, who doesn't need more of that? So let me leave you with this as I wrap up today's Black Belt Leadership Podcast. I want to challenge you, I want to encourage you to embrace the sound of silence. Because it's in the sound of silence that you and I have the opportunity to reset, to refocus, and to recalibrate our lives. And when we do those three things, reset, refocus, and recalibrate our lives, we get an opportunity to experience more success in every area of our lives. So go practice the sound of silence and be intentional about it and look and see what it does in your life. And with that, I want to say thanks for joining me. I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Have a great day.